So as we continue our team coverage this morning, we have Valley Civil Rights Attorney Benjamin Taylor joining us. So Benjamin, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I want to jump into this now and talk about Minnesota law. Okay, so it requires Chauvin only be sentenced for the most serious charge of second-degree murder. Can you break down what exactly that means?
Yes, for the second-degree murder charge, that's the highest charge that he was being charged with. That carries a term up to 40 years in prison. However, because of his background, he probably won't get 40 years in prison. And the judge is going to look at some of his mitigating factors and aggravating factors. Aggravating factors means the way he had his knee on George Floyd's neck, the longer amount of time he had on the neck. So that's an aggravating factor. So basically, what the prosecutor had to prove yesterday, what they did, because it was a guilty verdict, that he killed George Floyd. It didn't have to be intentional murder. Intentional murder is first degree. This is a lower charge, second degree murder. But he killed George Floyd, and he did something that was wrong and violated police policy. So that's why we have the second degree murder charge.
Okay, so what is going to happen next with sentencing? We know that is going to be happening in the next 8 weeks.
Yes, so sentencing is going to happen in 8 weeks. The reason why it takes 8 weeks to sentence him, because he has a chance, he meaning Derek Chauvin has a chance to present evidence to the judge for a lower amount of sentence. The prosecutor is going to do what you call an aggravation hearing and submit evidence to the judge to try to get his sentence to a higher standard. So right now, he's looking at between around 12 to 15 years. It's called a presumptive term. That's where the judge starts out with as far as the sentencing. But after the prosecutor presents aggravating factors, the fact that he had the knee on his neck for so long, the fact that he didn't take the knee off of his neck, the fact that he might have not had a heart for George Floyd, the prosecutor can aggravate the sentence to a higher sentence. So that's what the state is going to try to do. Once the judge hears all of that, after the 8 weeks, they'll go in front of the judge. They'll present their arguments. Of course, the state's going to present all the bad facts. The defense attorney's going to try to present some good facts in order to try to lower the sentence. And at the end of the day, it'll be ultimately up to the judge to decide what sentence Derek Chauvin will receive.
And we will see what Judge Cahill says in 8 weeks about it. You know, it took the jury just over 10 hours of deliberation here, just about 10 hours. So was this expected?
When we do a lot of trials, and when you do a trial and the jury comes back in around 10 hours, that means you already knew that it was going to be a guilty verdict. Usually, juries take a longer amount of time. The longer amount of time that the jury was going to be out, that would have helped Derek Chauvin. But because the jury came back, less than 10 hours, I mean, they deliberated, less than a day, basically. They pretty much already knew the verdict. They all have to be unanimous. I mean, every single juror, all 12 of them, have to be unanimous. So that means all of them were on the same mindset. All of them knew that it felt that he was guilty, and they pretty much came in there and said guilty.
Right, and a lot of people surprised that nobody even asked any follow-up questions in that deliberation process. So we can't forget that 3 other former officers are also going to be charged in the death of George Floyd, each charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Can you break down what those charges mean?
Yes, so the other officers are charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. What that means is aiding and abetting that they didn't step in and get Derek Chauvin's knee off of George Floyd's neck. They pretty much stood around and just kind of watched, and they didn't really do anything. So under the law, even though the other officers' knees weren't on George Floyd's neck, they are just as guilty or just as liable for this act of murder, and this is what the prosecutor is charging them with, and they can get almost the same amount of time as Derek Chauvin, even though their knee was on their neck, because they were aiding and abetting and didn't do anything to prevent the murder of George Floyd.
So if convicted, you're saying they potentially could face up to 40 years in prison as well?
Yes, correct. They can face up to 40 years of time, even though their knee wasn't on George Floyd's neck, even though Derek Chauvin was the main person in this act of killing George Floyd, as the jury said, they can face the same amount of time as Derek Chauvin because they were there, they wear the badge, they have a responsibility to protect and serve the public, and because George Floyd dies under their watch, they can get the same amount of time as Derek Chauvin.
All right, civil rights attorney Benjamin Taylor, thank you so much for your insight. We really appreciate you breaking all of that down for us. Have a good morning, and the rest of you stick around. We are going to be right back with more news.
All right, thank you for having me.